Hi, everybody, and welcome to the next installment of our webinar series. So this month we're talking about reproductive control and gender-based violence. And I would first like to offer a content warning. So some of the content you're about to hear might be upsetting, so please practice good self-care and step away or pause if you need to. And I would also like to acknowledge that the Women's Resource Center is located on Treaty 2 territory and operates on Treaty 1 territory, which are the lands of the Anishinaabeg, Cree, Oji-Cree, Assiniboine, Dakota, and Dene peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. So given that reproductive control is such a large topic, I thought we'd break it down into a few smaller topics, and we'd start by talking about reproductive rights. So reproductive rights are bound to a highly legal framework, and it's a very legalized definition of human rights and reproductive rights, which are essentially the recognition that people who have the capacity to give birth should have the right to control when or if that happens. And I'd like to be clear kind of right from the start that while issues that we're going to be talking about, like reproduction and reproductive control, disproportionately affect women, they don't only affect women. Non-binary folks, as well as trans boys and men, may also become pregnant. And there are also cis women who can't become pregnant. So it's not just, a women's issue, although it is predominantly a women's issue. It's good to acknowledge that it's not just that. So there are a few international human rights provisions that kind of tangentially protect reproductive rights. One of those would be the right to self-determination under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the right to life, the right to liberty and security of the person, and the right to be free from cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment under the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. And reproductive rights are also protected on the international level in a very direct way through CEDAW, or the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Specifically, Article 16, which protects women's rights to decide when or if they have children. And each country also has the ability to determine through either legislation or case law whether or not reproductive rights are protected, which rights are protected, all of that kind of stuff. And that really varies considerably based on the country that you're talking about. So to illustrate kind of how this varies based on jurisdiction, I'm going to give you the examples of Canada and Poland. So for example, here in Canada, we don't have any restrictions of any kind on abortion or contraception, which are kind of two huge parts of reproductive rights. They're not the only parts, but they're like very, very huge parts of reproductive rights. And the reason that we don't have any restrictions on abortion or contraception is because of the Morgentaler decision of 1988 that came from the Supreme Court of Canada. So this decision took the aspects of the criminal code that criminalized abortion and it repealed them. So now it's always the decision of the person who's pregnant, whether or not to have an abortion, when to have an abortion, and nobody is permitted to interfere with that choice. Abortion is considered an essential healthcare procedure here in Canada. So it's treated as any other healthcare procedure would be. And since 1988, actually, there have been several governments and even individual politicians who have tried to introduce legislation that would restrict or place conditions on abortion care or even outright prohibit it. However, none of these proposed measures have been successful, fortunately. And it's also kind of good to just reiterate that Canada is not governed by a specific law or a specific statute that says abortion is legal in Canada, as it was decriminalized, meaning that the section of the criminal code that made abortion a crime was nullified, making it no longer a crime to obtain or to perform abortions. However, since the United States Supreme Court decision, Roe versus Wade reversal, some people have started to argue that, it might be a good idea for Canada to have like a specific abortion law on the books saying that, abortion is legal in an effort to make sure that it stays legal. However, many in the gender and reproductive fields have said that, maybe that's not a good idea for us to do that. And there are two main reasons. The first is that if there were to be legislation introduced, a law on the books, that would open the door wide for successive governments to come in and relatively easily amend that legislation to either prohibit abortion or to add restrictions or conditions to it. And we would see that abortion rights would begin to backslide in that situation. And the other reason is that currently abortion is treated as a healthcare procedure here in Canada. It's treated as any other healthcare procedure would be, and the worry is that by introducing legislation on abortion specifically would be singling it out and potentially adding stigma to a routine medical procedure that already has quite a significant stigma attached to it. And that's something that we also don't want. So while Canada has quite liberal abortion law, provisions, a starkly oppositional example would be that of Poland. And in Poland, initially abortion was made legal beginning in 1956, as it was also considered a public health measure and a way to ensure that maternal mortality rates didn't increase. And also because contraception was not widely available in Poland at the time, this subsidized abortion care was used by quite a lot of people. However, in the 1990s, after the fall of communism and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Catholic Church began to exercise a lot of control in Polish society, and as a result, abortion care became severely restricted, although not completely prohibited, beginning in the year 1993. And experts estimate that, after these restrictions started to be implemented, the ratio of legal to illegal abortions in Poland was somewhere around 1 to 10. So for every one legal abortion, there were approximately 10 illegal abortions happening. And the illegal abortions that were being performed were, not necessarily always done safely or in a way that, was healthy. And that kind of really illustrates this adage that we're seeing a lot on social media that, you can't outlaw abortion, you can only outlaw safe abortion. And, since the 1990s in Poland, successive right-wing governments have worked to further restrict abortion. And currently, actually, Poland has some of the most restrictive abortion laws in the world, with the only exceptions being if the life of the pregnant person is in danger or if the pregnancy is a result of a criminal act. And actually, if medical professionals are found to have violated Poland's abortion laws, they actually could face jail time. And this kind of comparison is really useful, I think, just to kind of illustrate, the ways that different countries legislate abortion or, either guarantee reproductive rights or not. And of course, a hot button topic right now is the June 24th reversal of Roe versus Wade by the United States Supreme Court. And Roe versus Wade was a ruling from 1973 that declared that whether or not to get an abortion was protected under the right to individual privacy and therefore could not be legislated against, which essentially guaranteed the right to abortion on a federal level. However, the current Supreme Court of the United States decided that they did not like that reasoning. In the original decision in 1973, they decided that the legal reasoning was weak. They decided that abortion was not covered federally under the individual right to privacy. And, the matter of whether or not to allow abortion should be left to each state to decide, not to the individual person. And as a result, almost immediately, nearly half of states had a trigger law that took effect, which essentially meant that almost half of the states had either severe restrictions on abortions or outright prohibitions on abortions in a very short period of time, which caused a lot of problems for people and are still causing a lot of problems for people. However, some of the Supreme Courts at the state level have struck down the bans or restrictions that some state legislatures are trying to enact. And women's and gender rights organizations have been fighting, of course, against any kind of ban or restriction on abortion since the decision was dropped. And before that, as we kind of had that forewarning that this was going to be happening. And this decision, or reversal of a decision, I suppose, really underscores how fragile some reproductive rights are and just how many people really seem to just want to take them away. However, it's not all doom and gloom in the reproductive rights world. There have been a couple of good developments recently, actually one here in Canada. There was the Supreme Court of Canada ruling from about a week ago in the case of R.V. Kirkpatrick that said it is a violation of consent and therefore a criminal act for one sexual partner to remove a condom during sex without the other partner knowing. So sometimes this is referred to as stealthing. It's a relatively new area of consent law, of sexual assault law, of reproductive rights. And actually just a few years ago, California made stealthing illegal on the state level after some situations had arisen where male partners were removing condoms during sex with their female partners without the female partners knowing. Of course, doing that greatly increases the risk of pregnancies and STDs for the female partner and constitutes a huge violation of consent. And the reasoning for the Supreme Court of Canada decision to this effect was that if somebody consents to sex with the condition of a condom, the removal of the condom would violate the consent to that particular sexual act. The person, usually a woman, consented to sex with a condom, meaning that she did not consent to sex without one, and violations of consent in sexual situations constitute sexual assault. And the Supreme Court of Canada recognized this in their decision, and this really marks a huge leap forward in reproductive rights and consent law and sexual assault law. So that was really good to see. And another good thing that happened actually just the other day was the referendum in Kansas on whether or not to keep abortion rights protected in their state constitution. And overwhelmingly, Kansans voted to keep the right to abortion enshrined in their state constitution, making this another huge victory for reproductive rights in that particular state, especially in the wake of the Roe versus Wade reversal. It's really good also kind of to distinguish reproductive rights that we've been talking about with the concept of reproductive justice as they are different. The reproductive rights framework that we've been talking about is one that's heavily based in law. And the reproductive justice approach that we're going to talk about is more different in that it's much more holistic. So the term reproductive justice itself was coined and developed in the 1990s by a group of Black women in the United States who had come together to discuss solutions to the problems that they and other women encounter in the realm of reproduction and human rights. They felt that the dominant reproductive rights framework did not serve everybody equally. And this is where the concept of reproductive justice was born, pun intended. The concept of reproductive justice combines the human rights architecture that we've already discussed and a social justice approach to reproduction in a way that's much more holistic than the reproductive rights framework. And this is really illustrated in the three core tenets of reproductive justice. The first being the right to have children, the second being the right to not have children, and the third being the right to nurture the children that people do have in a safe and healthy environment. So whereas the reproductive rights framework that we've already talked about is in a lot of ways centered around what we call negative rights, which means the freedom from something. So for example, the freedom from restriction on abortion, the freedom from interference in choice. The reproductive justice framework is centered largely around positive rights, or the right to something. So the right to contraception, the right to raise children in a safe and healthy environment. And the reproductive justice movement was largely a reaction to the inequality and racism that many Black women faced and still do face when it comes to reproduction. To use one example of this, in the 1980s and 1990s, and even beyond that, Black women were made to take birth control as a requirement for being on social assistance. And, as if that weren't bad enough on its own, forcing somebody to be on birth control. The method that was used, which was the arm implant, it was called Norplant at the time. It was extremely underdeveloped and undertested, and it actually caused a lot of health and safety problems for the women who were using it. It was making people sick. And this is an example of a government policy that was used as a measure of control over the bodies of Black women to prevent them from having children, in many cases against their wishes. And it, of course, is a huge violation of women's rights to self-determination and rights to their own body. And actually, Dorothy Roberts wrote a book on race and reproduction called Killing the Black Body. It's just this one right here. And I cannot recommend it enough if you're somebody who is interested in learning more about reproductive justice and specifically the experiences of Black women when it comes to reproduction and human rights. It's a really good read. But really, though, what the women Roberts discussed in her book, what they experienced, was nothing other than state-sanctioned reproductive coercion. So what is reproductive coercion? Essentially, it's when someone is coerced into either reproducing or not reproducing against their will. A lot of times it's something that is done in the context of intimate relationships where, one partner will try to convince or force the other to have a baby when they don't want to, or to not have a baby, even in some cases. Reproductive coercion is also something that can be achieved through government policy, like through reducing access to or prohibiting abortion and contraception, cutting funding to specific healthcare programs like prenatal care, forced sterilization policies, mandated usage of birth control, like we just talked about a minute ago. And actually, Canada has its own ugly history with state-sanctioned reproductive coercion. We've already talked about that example from the States out of Dorothy Roberts's book, but historically we've not been any better at all here in that sense. To use one example, through the course of the late 1800s and early to mid 1900s, a program of government-sanctioned forced sterilization of Indigenous women and girls took place. So this program was entirely based on colonial and racist ideas of white supremacy and the alleged unfitness of Indigenous women and girls to be mothers. So what happened was tens of thousands of Indigenous women and girls, probably more, were sterilized forcibly without their knowledge. And a lot of times this would happen when somebody would go in to give birth by a C-section, and while the doctors were in there, they would tie her tubes without her knowledge or consent. And this is something that the woman would then only find out about later on in life, maybe when she went to have other children and found if she was having trouble, or if she would have, reproductive issues with reproductive organs, as oftentimes the sterilization procedures were not done particularly well at all. And the reverberations of these essentially eugenics programs are felt today, as a lot of the women who were forcibly sterilized are living today and tell their stories, as a lot of these forced sterilizations happened well into the 1950s, 1960s. I think it's also worth noting that under the Rome Statute, the intentional prevention of childbirth within a particular group counts as genocide. So I think it's worth mentioning that as well. And ultimately, reproductive coercion is about power and it's about control. It's about taking away agency from people who can get pregnant, whether that's for reasons of religion or racism or xenophobia or otherwise. It's always about control. And a lot of times in the context of intimate relationships, reproductive coercion looks like birth control sabotage, it looks like pregnancy outcome control or adoption pressuring, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth in a moment. But I think that it's good to also kind of look at the flip side of the reproductive coercion coin, which is coercive needleism. So it's a type of reproductive control that aims to encourage births, usually within a specific group, whereas many types of reproductive control that we've talked about already aim to decrease births, again, within a specific group usually. It can include messages disseminated via media that glorify motherhood and seem to suggest that women must have children. Just thinking about the media that we consume on a daily basis, doesn't just about every female character arc include motherhood at some point, whether that be books or movies or TV or whatever. Messages like this and telling stories almost exclusively like this suggest that womanhood and motherhood are synonymous when they're not. The coercive pronatalism ideology can be something that's also suggested either subtly or not by family and friends. So this can be either through, seemingly innocent remarks to women between usually the ages of like 22 and 40, usually married or partnered, although not exclusively. saying things, like, oh, when are you going to start having kids? Or how many kids do you want? Or when you're a mother, you'll see. Or, you don't know true love until you're a mother. All of these kinds of seemingly innocent remarks are kind of reinforcing this pronatalist kind of ideology. And in some cases, family or friends even kind of outright insist that women reproduce as frequently and as soon as possible. However, perhaps maybe to me the most insidious form of coercive pronatalism comes from popular coercive natalism discourses that have an effect on government policy. And by popular discourses, I mean prevalent societal attitudes about sex and gender that permeate multiple layers of society and influence the choices that people make. For example, when they vote, which would lead to the election of politicians with coercive pronatalist agendas. And even politicians who do not necessarily consciously subscribe to these ideas of sex and gender that are consistent with a coercive pronatalist agenda are still subject to the discussions that are happening in broader society about sex, about gender, womanhood, motherhood, and they all have their own opinions on these matters that influence their decision making, again, even if they're not consciously aware that it's a part of this coercive pronatalist discourse that's happening. And there are a lot of reasons why someone's views may end up aligning with coercive pronatalism, again, whether they consciously know this to be the case or not. One of them being racism, or the idea that some races of people should be reproducing less than they are, and to combat that, other groups need to reproduce more. Nationalism is another reason, or the idea that more babies are needed to build up the population of a country and to combat low birth rates. Could be xenophobia, or the idea that there are too many children of immigrants, and so non-immigrants need to reproduce more to prevent being outnumbered. Could be for reasons of religion, or the idea that one's religious beliefs will have an impact on how they view reproductive rights and justice. Could be ethnocentrism, or the idea that one or a few ethnicities are reproducing either too much or not enough. Or it could be for reasons of nativism, or the idea that there are not enough children of the native population of a country compared to the number of children being born to non-native populations. And this idea is tied very closely with xenophobia and also with some very popular far right-wing conspiracy theories. And of course, all of these ideas of coercive pronatalism that we've talked about just now are tied very closely to eugenics, where the process of deciding who is and who is not fit to reproduce, an idea which, of course, historically has a horrible track record. Coercive pronatalism, as we've discussed, is something that can also come about through government policies, as well as through the familial manipulation tactics that we've discussed. And there are several ways that governments do this. So one is that they can begin to spread propaganda or misinformation about abortion or contraception. They can restrict or outright ban contraceptives. They can offer financial incentives for having large families. They can restrict or ban abortions. And all of these tactics have been used at one point or another by governments that have a coercive pronatalist bent. So, for example, during the Second World War, Nazi Germany gave out awards to Aryan German women who had large families. They would give out awards after they've had a certain number of children had been born. And then again, if they have another certain number of children. So that's kind of a way that they try to increase births within a specific population group. And the state of Georgia actually just came out the other day with a proposed amendment to their personal tax code that would allow families to list unborn fetuses that have a detectable heartbeat as dependents and allow them to receive tax refunds on that basis in an effort to discourage abortion in post-Roe America. You may have gathered so far that there seem to be quite a number of ways in which reproductive control, reproductive coercion intersect with issues of gender-based violence, sexual assault, and intimate partner violence. And I think to start to illustrate that, I'm going to start with a statistic. So there was a study done where 641 women who were receiving routine OBGYN care at an American hospital, 16% of those women stated that they had been pressured by their partner to get pregnant when they did not want to be. And that is an astonishingly high number. And it just goes to show how common reproductive control and coercion are in intimate relationships. Reproductive coercion itself is a type of coercive control, and coercive control is a type of intimate partner violence where the perpetrator aims to make the survivor dependent on them through isolating and manipulating them, and it can manifest as, telling somebody when or if they can leave the house, who they're allowed to go out with, when they have to be back, what they're allowed to wear, isolating them from their family and friends through manipulation tactics, turning them against their family or turning their family against them. Could be through isolating them physically, through leaving an area where somebody's family or friends live and isolating them from that network of support. It could be threatening harm. It could be through degrading and humiliating them, could be through emotional and psychological abuse, withholding resources, could be financial abuse, and many more other aspects of coercive control. That's just, a few of them. And in the context of intimate relationships, reproductive coercion is perpetrated in a number of ways. So it could be sexual assault, it could be physical violence, it could be threatening to leave the relationship if the survivor doesn't do what the perpetrator says in terms of reproduction. Could be trying to manipulate them into having a child by saying things like, if you really loved me, you'd give me a baby, that kind of thing. Could be withholding medical care from the survivor. Could be sabotaging their birth control, things like hiding their birth control pills or throwing them away. Could be through removing condoms or other barrier methods during sex, poking holes in condoms, or it could be things like forgetting to pull out. It could be controlling the outcome of a pregnancy, as oftentimes perpetrators will either prevent survivors from accessing abortion care to force a pregnancy, or preventing them from accessing, other kinds of health care after impregnating them, or in other cases, perpetrators will force an abortion after impregnating someone. And again, reproductive coercion is entirely about control. It's about the perpetrator's ability to control the survivor's body and what happens to it. Sometimes they do it to force the survivor to become dependent on them. Sometimes they do it in an attempt to create permanent ties to the survivor through a child. However, unfortunately, these experiences of reproductive coercion and control in the context of intimate relationships are not uncommon, as we saw with the 16% statistic from earlier. And oftentimes, if women are experiencing intimate partner violence, whether that be physical, emotional, psychological, sexual, financial, whatever, they are also likely experiencing reproductive coercion, as intimate partner violence and reproductive coercion are very closely linked. And also, one of the strongest indicators that has been found for lethality in a situation of intimate partner violence is the presence of reproductive coercion. So if reproductive coercion is present in a situation where intimate partner violence is happening, that is an indicator that that relationship may turn lethal. And of course, you can't talk about gender-based violence and sexual assault, reproductive rights and justice without also talking about how this intersects and interacts with abortion rights and the right to contraception. So now that we know that reproductive coercion in intimate relationships and also through government policy are things that are common for women to experience, it makes it all the more critical that access to abortion and contraception are and remain human rights. Being able to access abortion care and contraception can be and are life-saving for people. Maybe, it's because they have a medical condition that would put their life in danger were the pregnancy to continue. Maybe it's because they just don't want to be pregnant. Maybe it's because being pregnant would interfere with your career or education plans. At the end of the day, whatever the reason is, people should have access to abortion and contraception no matter what. However, in cases of reproductive coercion and intimate partner violence, access to abortion and contraception can be doubly life-saving. So when survivors have access to medical care, this is a point of contact where professionals can then screen for reproductive coercion and intimate partner violence and intervene if necessary. So for example, if a doctor notices that somebody's coming in for birth control a lot more frequently than they should be, that would be a point where they would screen for reproductive coercion and intimate partner violence. And maybe the doctor finds that the person's partner keeps hiding or throwing away their birth control pills. That would be reproductive coercion. Or in situations where people experience reproductive coercion and intimate partner violence, not being able to get an abortion may literally be the difference between being able to get away from that abusive partner and not. So having access to abortion and contraception may be an integral part for a survivor's safety plan, and not having that access to those things would put them at an elevated risk. And I think this quote that I've included here at the bottom of the slide that I came across, during reading for this webinar really ties together all of the things that we've been talking about so far with how these concepts of reproductive justice and reproductive rights, coercion and control, sexual assault and gender-based violence are all linked. So the quote says, "The abuser who hides the birth control pills, the sleaze who slips off the condom, the anti-choice protester yelling invectives at women seeking abortions, and the politicians writing the laws to make it harder to get contraception and abortions are all pieces of the same puzzle. All of them want to take away a woman's basic right to self-determination, and all of them do it because they subscribe to an ideology that paints men as the natural dominators and even owners of women." And that just really ties together all of the things that we've been talking about. However, it is also good to note that not everybody experiences reproductive rights, reproductive justice, intimate partner violence, gender-based violence in the same ways. And that's as a result of several intersecting factors that somebody would experience these things differently. So things like gender identity, race, age, socioeconomic status, education, geographic location, all of these things can affect somebody's experience. And in Canada, for example, Indigenous women and girls experience the highest rates of intimate partner violence at about 6 times the rate of non-Indigenous women. Non-binary, gender fluid, gender non-conforming folks, as well as trans women, also experience elevated levels of intimate partner violence and violence just as a whole. Rural women also experience intimate partner violence at a rate that is about 75% higher than women who live in an urban setting. And additionally, living rurally also presents a set of unique challenges for survivors of intimate partner violence and reproductive coercion. To use this as an example, medical care is often inaccessible. Perhaps it's due to a lack of rural providers, or maybe it's more difficult for women to access it due to geographical factors. Also, many women who experience intimate partner violence and who need medical care might be hesitant to seek that medical care for reasons of privacy. So in rural communities, often there are heightened levels of familiarity or situations, where everybody knows everybody kind of thing. And it may be uncomfortable for a survivor to attend a medical center for care if they know the provider personally. The same goes for accessing justice services in rural communities. Survivors might be hesitant to do that if there's a high level of personal familiarity with the police in the community. And, other times there's just simply not adequate justice services within somebody's community to meet their needs. Some other specific concerns that many rural women survivors of intimate partner violence and reproductive coercion face are around the potential presence of firearms and the dangers that pose, as approximately 1 in 3 domestic homicides in Canada are committed with a firearm. There's also the idea that, if they leave, then they may be leaving behind animals that the perpetrator could harm, as sometimes perpetrators use the threat of harm to animals or livestock as a way to keep the survivor in the home. Women may also be unable to leave for financial reasons. So for example, if all of their assets are tied up in the family farm or family business, that would make it extremely difficult for them to seek help or to leave. In situations where intimate partner violence and reproductive coercion are present in a community, kind of where everybody knows everybody, survivors also might be hesitant to come forward due to the concern that they won't be believed by the people that they and their partner both know. And that could be compounded by, many times in rural communities, cell phone reception and internet service are either unreliable or prohibitively expensive. And that can pose as a barrier for survivors trying to leave a situation of intimate partner violence. And all of these kind of barriers to accessing care really point to the fact that ensuring that reproductive rights and reproductive justice are present in all communities in a way that can be accessed by all people who may experience intimate partner violence and reproductive coercion is integral to allowing people to claim their human rights. So after hearing all that, you might be thinking, well, what can I do that would, help somebody? And I think the first thing is to always believe survivors. Doing that is a huge part of breaking down the stigma surrounding gender-based violence. The importance of education is also something that I would point to. So especially on issues like reproductive control and coercion that are not talked about perhaps as much as other, also very important issues. Education is where power comes from, and we can't change things that we don't know exist. So encourage others that to watch this webinar to learn more, or watch some of our other webinars that are available on our YouTube channel. You can talk to your family and friends, making sure the people in your life know that you're a safe space to discuss issues of intimate partner violence or reproductive coercion. If they ever need to, could make all the difference for somebody. And of course, reach out for help if you need it as well. Our doors are always open to talk to women experiencing intimate partner violence and reproductive coercion. We have specifically trained domestic violence and sexual assault counselors, as well as advocates that can help you navigate the health and justice processes or with anything else you might need. So I've included at the end here our contact information, both our general contact information, phone and email, as well as my contact information. If at any time you need resources or you need to talk to somebody, please feel free to reach out to us. And I thank you for joining us today for our webinar series.